"Move your toy soldier off my mooring," the man in the white blazer said, "or I'll move him for you." He said it to me, because I was the one wearing the radio. He said it about Wexford, who stood 12 feet away on the head of the Sovereign's Quay with his rifle at the order and his eyes on the harbor mouth, and who did not so much as let his gaze flick toward the voice. I have stood beside Daniel Wexford for 6 years on the King's Harbor watch, and in that time I have seen the sea try every trick it owns to make a man flinch: a green wave over the wall in a March gale, a mooring line parting like a pistol shot a foot from his face, a gull dropping out of the fog straight at his bearskin. He had not flinched at any of it. The man in the blazer did not know that yet, and watching him learn it was going to be the best part of my morning. His name, I would find out within the hour, was Cashin Murrath, and he owned a great deal of the world's water in the sense that he believed he had bought the right to be on any of it he chose. The boat behind him said so for him, 140 feet of white motor yacht, all flying bridge and tinted glass, and a name in gold letters along her flank, Lacuna, sitting just off the head of the quay with her bow thrusters mumbling, holding position against the morning tide while her owner stood on our stone and told us where she was going to tie up. Where she was going to tie up was the Royal Berth. You have to understand what the Royal Berth is, on the Sovereign's Quay, or none of the rest of this makes sense. The quay is a long arm of dressed granite that reaches out into the harbor of the port we kept. I will call it Stoneharrow, because the real name is the King's and I will not put it in a story, and most of its length is honest working stone where the harbor master moors the pilot launches and the lifeboat and the customs cutter. But the last 100 feet, the seaward head where the water runs deepest and a hull lies safest in a blow, is kept clear. There are bronze bollards there worn smooth as river stones by 300 years of royal hawsers, a set of granite steps down to the tide that the household barges have used since before any blazer was sewn, and a single line of polished chain marking it off from the common quay. And on the very last flat of stone before the steps, a King's Harbor guard stands his watch in full dress, because the berth is reserved for the sovereign's vessels and the household craft, and for nothing else that floats, no matter how white it is or how much it cost. That was the berth Cashin Murrath wanted, and that was the man standing on it. "I'm talking to you," Murrath said to me. He had stepped over the polished chain to do it. Most people don't step over the chain. There is something about a low chain and a tall man in a bearskin that keeps the ordinary citizen on the right side of it without a word being said. Murrath stepped over it the way another man would step over a garden hose. There's a harbor master somewhere who's going to lose his job today, and you're going to lose yours after him, unless that statue gets out of my way and someone makes that berth ready for my boat. I have guests aboard. We've come a long way. I don't intend to anchor off in the swell like a fishing smack while you decide whether to do your jobs. I am a lance corporal of the harbor watch, which means it falls to me to be the one who talks so that Wexford does not have to. That is how the post works. There is the sentry, who holds and does not speak, and the man on the radio, who moves and answers, so the stillness of the one is never the thing that has to break. I had answered 100 Murraths before him, most of them politely curious tourists wanting a photograph, none quite so sure that the morning belonged to them. "Sir," I said, "this is a reserved royal mooring. It's not available to private craft. The harbor master's office is at the root of the quay, the green door under the clock. They'll find you a good berth in the inner basin, alongside or on a swinging mooring, your choice. There's water and shore power there. There's none out here. I don't want the inner basin." He didn't even look at me. He was looking past me down the quay at the bollards at the deep water measuring. "The inner basin is full of plastic. I want the deep berth. My boat draws 9 feet and she needs the deep water and the holding, and that," he pointed at the head of the quay with a finger that wore a ring worth more than the lifeboat, "is the deep water and the holding. So we're going to clear it. You're going to take down that little chain, Walk your tin man back to wherever you keep him between performances, and we are going to bring Lacuna alongside before my coffee gets cold." Behind us, on the inner curve of the harbor, the bell on the customs cutter struck the half-hour, flat and bright across the water. The tide was making. I could hear it sucking and chuckling at the granite under the head of the quay, the way it did 2 hours before the top of the flood, and I knew, because knowing the tide is half of what we are out there for, that within 90 minutes the stream through the harbor mouth was going to turn and run hard, the way it always ran hard at Stonehorow on a making spring tide. The man wanted to tie his enormous white boat to the one place on the coast where, in an hour and a half, the water was going to do its level best to take her away again. He did not know that, knowing that was also part of the job. "She can't lie here, sir," I said. "Even if it were permitted, this isn't a berth for a vessel of her length on a spring tide. When the stream turns through the mouth, it sets straight across this stone at 4 knots and more. You'd lie here 20 minutes, and then you'd lie across the steps, and then you'd lie on the rocks under the light. The inner basin is sheltered. It's where she ought to be." For 1 second I thought reason had reached him. He turned and looked at me properly for the first time, and there was a flicker of something that might, in a better man, have become listening. Then a woman's voice came down off the yacht's flying bridge. "Cass, are we tying up or not? Margot's asking." And whatever might have become listening closed over like water over a dropped stone. "We're tying up," he called back without turning. And to me, lower, with all the patience gone out of it, "I have had enough of being managed by men in costumes. Take the chain down." "I can't do that, sir." "Then I'll do it." And he walked past me, toward Wexford and the head of the quay, to take the berth he thought he could take. I want to be careful here about what Wexford did, because the whole of it matters, and because in the weeks afterward a great many people described it who were not there, and most of them got it exactly wrong. They said he squared up. They said he leveled the rifle. They said there was a confrontation on the quay, a standoff, the guard and the millionaire eye to eye. None of that happened, and the fact that none of it happened is the entire reason the morning ended the way it did. What Wexford did was nothing. He stood at the order on the head of the quay as he had stood since 6 that morning, and would stand until his relief came at noon, the butt of the rifle grounded by his right boot, the bearskin square, the white gloves still, his eyes on the harbor mouth where a guard's eyes belong. He did not turn toward Murreth. He did not brace. He let the man come. Murreth reached the polished chain that marked the royal head of the quay, the second chain, the one nobody steps over, and he took hold of the bronze stanchion to unhook it. And when the catch did not give at once, he made a sound of pure disgust and put his shoulder into Wexford instead, shoved him. 2 flat hands against the red wool of the tunic. A hard sideways push meant to send a man stumbling off his line, so the picture would be of a guard knocked aside, and a free berth behind him. Wexford did not stumble. He gave perhaps an inch, the way the quay itself gives an inch to a wave, and then he was exactly where he had been, square on his stone, eyes forward, rifle grounded. He had not put out a hand. He had not set himself. He had simply not gone, the way the bollards behind him had not gone in 300 years of hawsers, and the man who had shoved him staggered a half pace from his own unspent effort, and had to catch the chain to keep his feet. It is a strange thing to watch a man shove a wall and nearly fall down. "Did you see that?" Murreth said. He was breathing hard, more from temper than effort, and he had gone a particular shade of red I have learned to recognize over the years, the color of a man who has just done something in front of witnesses that he would very much like to have happen instead to someone else. He spun toward the rope line, where a knot of early visitors and 2 or 3 fishermen mending pots had stopped to watch. He pushed me. You all saw it. He assaulted me. "I'll have his number. I'll have him charged." "You laid hands on the King's sentry, sir," I said, "and I had the radio up by then, and I keyed it once, the long press that brings the harbor master and the duty sergeant both, on royal ground, in front of 40 people in the harbor cameras. I think very carefully about whose number gets taken." He looked at me. He looked at the rope line, at the phones already up. There are always phones now, even out here where the wind takes your hat, at the steady red back of the man he had shoved, who had still not so much as glanced at him. And then he made the choice that ruined him, though it would take the rest of the morning and the rest of the tide to finish the job. He decided that the problem was not that he had shoved a guard. The problem was that the guard was still in his way. He turned back to the chain, got the catch open this time, and let it drop with a clash onto the granite. "Bring her in," he shouted up at the yacht. "Bring her alongside. They won't do a thing. They never do." That was the part he had right in the wrong way. We would not do a thing, not the thing he meant, not a hand laid on him, not a shout, not a scuffle on the quay for the phones to feast on. The sea would do the thing. We would only let it. I keyed the radio again and spoke quietly into it, and what I said was not about Berth at all. What I said was the tide. Let me tell you about Daniel Wexford, because you cannot understand why he stood so still unless you know what the stillness was made of, and because the man in the white blazer had decided, on no evidence but a uniform, that the stillness was made of nothing. Before he was a King's Harbor guard, he was a coxswain. Not a yachtsman, a coxswain, which is a different animal entirely. For 9 years he took the all-weather lifeboat off this same coast, into the kind of weather that empties harbors. The old hands at that station talk about him the way men talk about someone they have followed into water they did not expect to come out of. They do not say he was brave, exactly. They say he was calm, which out there is the rarer and more useful thing. On the worst night any of them remembered, a coaster aground on a lee shore in a full gale, 11 men in her crew and the rocket line parting twice, Wexford lay the lifeboat alongside that dying ship 9 separate times in the dark, and took the men off 1 and 2 at a time, and never once raised his voice. The man at the helm beside him said the only way you knew Wexford was frightened was that he got quieter. He got all the men off. 11 for 11. The coaster broke up an hour later on the tide. So when Cash and Berth looked at the back of that red tunic and saw a tin man, a costume, a statue to be shoved out of the way of a coffee, he was looking at one of the calmest men ever to take a boat into a sea that wanted him dead. And he had decided, because the man was standing still, that the man was empty. That is the mistake the sea cures in people. It was about to cure it in him. Wexford had taken the King's Harbor watch when his shoulder finally told him it was done with lifeboats, and he had taken it for a reason he gave me once, on a flat calm dawn with the harbor like a sheet of pewter, when I asked him whether he missed the boats. He said he didn't much, and then he said the thing I have never forgotten. He said, the whole job out there was holding still in the worst place, long enough so the ones who couldn't hold could get off. That's all the boat was, a thing that held still in the worst place. I just do it on land now and the worst place hasn't come yet. But it will. It always does. And when it does I'll already be standing in it. Then his relief came and he handed off the watch and we never spoke of it again. I thought of that, standing on the Sovereign's quay with a dropped chain ringing in my ears and 140 feet of white yacht swinging her bow toward our royal stone. Because the worst place was coming, on the tide, the way it always does, and Daniel Wexford was already standing in it. The yacht came in beautifully, I will give her that. Whoever had the helm of Lacuna knew his trade. He laid her great flank along the head of the quay, as gently as you would lay a sleeping child in a cot, and a deckhand stepped ashore with a heaving line, and dropped a loop over the worn bronze, bollard the King's barges have used for 300 years. Berth directed it all with the large gestures of a man who has watched other men do work, and his guests came out onto the side deck with glasses in their hands to see the famous old royal mooring their host had got them for the weekend. There were perhaps a dozen of them, a great many people to have aboard a vessel that is about to find out what the tide at Stonehorow does to things that should not be there. The harbormaster arrived at a run, which a harbormaster of his years should not have to do, red in the face and already shaking his head. His name was Pell, and Pell had run the harbor for 22 years, and Pell knew exactly what I knew about the tide, and he tried. I will always remember that he tried. He went up to Murth courteous and plain. He told him the berth was reserved and could not be used. He told him, when that got nowhere, that reserved or not, the berth was unsafe within the hour, that the stream would turn and set her across the steps, that he had seen bigger boats than Lacuna put on the rocks under the light by exactly this water on exactly this tide, and that he was asking him man to man, as one seaman to another, to take her round to the basin where she would be safe. And Murth laughed at him. One seaman to another, he said, delighted, to his guests on the deck above, so they could enjoy it too. Did you hear that? He thinks we're the same trade. He turned back to Pell with the smile still on. I have crossed 3 oceans in this boat. I have a captain below who holds every certificate your little harbor has ever heard of. I do not need a man in a peaked cap who moors fishing boats for a living to tell me about the tide. Now, the berth is mine for the weekend. I'll pay your fees, double, triple, whatever the royal rate is, put it on a card. Send me the harbor master who can take a payment and take this one away. Pell looked at him for a long moment. Then Pell looked at me, and at Wexford on the head of the quay with his eyes on the harbor mouth, and something passed between the 3 of us that did not need words, because all 3 of us were sea people, and the man on the deck above was not, whatever his certificate said, and the difference was about to be settled by something none of us controlled and all of us understood. Log the time, Pell said to me quietly. Log that I advised him to move and he refused. Log the state of the tide. He said it the way you set a thing down in writing so that later, when it is needed, it is already there and cannot be bought. And get the cutter's crew standing by. Not for him, for the people he's got aboard. I logged it. I have the page still. It says the time, and it says fair weather, light airs, and it says, Master of M.Y. Lacuna advised by Harbor Master the berth is reserved and unsafe on the making tide. Declined. Proceeded to moor. Stream to turn approx 9:30. And then it says, in Pell's own hand, because he took the pencil from me to write it. I have asked him 3 times. That is the most a man can do for another man who will not be helped. The tide turned at 29 minutes past 9. I know because I was watching for it. You do not always see a tide turn. On a soft day in a sheltered place, it slides over from ebb to flood without a sign, and you only know it has happened because the weed on the piles starts to lean the other way. But Stonehorow is not a sheltered place, and a making spring tide through that harbor mouth is one of the more honest pieces of water on the coast. When it turned that morning, you could watch it come. There is a line you can see, a seam in the surface where the new stream meets the slack, and it came in through the mouth like a hand drawn across a table, and where it passed, the flat morning water stood up into a quick, hard, hurrying flood that set straight across the head of the Sovereign's Quay at the rocks under the light, exactly as Pell had said it would, exactly as the granite under our boots had felt it do 10,000 times. Lacuna felt it first along her hull. I saw her stir, the way a sleeping thing stirs. The lines we had watched the deckhands make fast came up out of their easy bites and went bar-taut, humming, and the great white flank that had lain so gently against our fenders began to grind. Then the stream got properly under her, under all 140 feet of her, and she started to do the thing that a vessel does when it is moored wrong in a strong cross-set. She began to sheer. She swung her stern out into the harbor first, slow and enormous, and the afterspring snapped, not the line itself, but the cleat it was made fast to on her own deck, torn clean out of the teak with a crack you heard across the harbor. And then her bow came off the quay as the stream took charge of her, and she lay across the head of the Sovereign's Quay, broadside to the deep water and the steps and the rocks beyond. With one straining forward line and 300 tons of boat leaning her whole weight against it, and the flood building under her every second. The dozen guests on the side deck had stopped being a party. I watched the glasses go down on the rail and the faces change, the way faces change when the deck under them stops being furniture and becomes a thing that is moving, and one of the women cried out, and somebody, the captain I suppose, the one with all the certificates, got the engines going and tried to drive her off. But you do not drive a 140-foot boat off a quay across a 4-knot flood with a forward line still made fast. You only tighten the trap. The one line groaned. The worn bronze bollard it was fast to, the king's bollard, 300 years in the granite, took the strain and held, because it is set deeper than any cleat on any yacht ever built. And I knew in that instant that the bollard was not going to give, which meant the line was. And when the line went, the boat would be loose across the steps in the full of the flood, with a dozen people aboard who had come for a weekend and a host who had laughed at the man who tried to save them. That is the moment the morning was really about, not the shove. The shove was nothing, a small ugly thing a small man did. This was the thing the whole watch existed for, the worst place, come at last on the tide. And Daniel Wexford was already standing in it. He had not moved from his post during any of it, not when Murrith shoved him, not when the yacht came in, not when Pell pleaded and was laughed at. A King's Harbor guard holds his post. The post is the point. But there is a thing they teach you on the harbor watch, written in the standing orders in plain words, because once long ago it was not written, and a man stood at the order and watched the sea take people while he kept his ceremonial line. It says the guard's first duty is the king's, and the king's first care is his people, and therefore when there is life to be saved, the post releases the man to save it, and the saving of life is itself the king's service, and no breach of the watch at all. It is the one door in the standing orders, and it is a narrow one, and it opens only when the sea is taking somebody. The sea was taking somebody. I saw Wexford's head turn, the first time in 3 hours his eyes had left the harbor mouth, and I saw him read the whole of it in about the time it takes to read a sentence. The broadside boat, the single straining line, the flood still building, the steps, the rocks, the dozen people who in about 90 seconds were going to be adrift on a runaway hull in the worst water in the harbor. And I saw the stillness in him change. It did not break. That is the thing I want you to understand, the thing the man in the blazer never could have understood. The stillness did not break. It simply turned all at once, from the stillness of a man holding a line to the stillness of a man who has decided what to do, and is now going to do it without one wasted motion, which is the most frightening calm there is, and the only kind worth anything when the water has you. He grounded his rifle against the granite and set it down, laid it flat, the way you set down a thing you are not going to need where you are going, and he stripped off the white gloves and the bearskin in 2 movements and dropped them on the stone beside it. And he said to me, in the flat, quiet coxswain's voice I had only heard him use once before on that pewter dawn, 6 words, "Get the cutter. I'm taking the line." Then he went down the royal granite steps into the flood, to the head of the Sovereign's Quay, where the one straining line of the great white boat came down to the king's bollard, and he did the thing he had spent 9 years learning to do, the thing the man who shoved him had decided he could not possibly contain. He took charge of the worst place. It was 4 minutes, all told, 4 minutes in which a man I had stood beside for 6 years turned out to be carrying, the whole time, under the red wool and the famous stillness, the exact set of skills the morning happened to require. That is the thing about the harbor watch the Murriths of the world never see. We are not statues posted on the stone for decoration. We are, a remarkable number of us, the men the sea spat back, kept on the edge of the water on purpose. Because the day the water comes for someone, you want a man on that stone who has been into it before and come out, and who will go into it again without being told twice. The flood had Lacuna broadside now, and the single forward line was the only thing between her dozen people and the rocks under the light. If that line parted, she was gone. If it held her across the steps where the stream would pound her until her hull stove or her people went into the water, and people in good weekend clothes do not last long in 4 knots of cold spring flood. Wexford's read of it, I understood this only afterward, was that the boat could not be saved on that one line and could not be left on it either. She had to be got a stern line, run from her swinging quarter to the deep bollards further along the royal head, to break the sheer and bring her stern back toward the stone before the forward line went. And the only way to get that line was for a man to take the messenger from her quarter, in the water, off the steps, in the flood, and walk it to the bollard and make it fast, precisely the kind of thing a coxswain does, and precisely the kind of thing a man in a white blazer cannot even see needs doing. The captain on Lacuna's bridge could not do it. His place was at the helm, fighting the engines to spill the strain. The deckhands could not do it. They did not know the stone or the water, and a stranger in that flood would simply be a second emergency. The harbor master's cutter was 3 minutes away, and the boat had 90 seconds. There was one man on that coast in the right place at the right moment with the right 9 years behind him, and he was standing on the King's steps with his gloves off. Wexford braced himself at the foot of the steps where the granite met the running flood, set his back the way he had set it against Berth shove an hour before, the same stillness, the same refusal to be moved, turned now to use, and he called up to the deckhand on Lacuna's heaving quarter in a voice that carried flat and clear over the noise of the water and the engines, the way a coxswain's voice carries, telling the man exactly what he needed. The messenger line, weighted, thrown low and hard to his hand now. The deckhand, white-faced, did it. He had been trained well enough to know an order from a man who knew what he was doing, even an order from a bare-headed soldier standing waist-deep in a flood. And he threw, and Wexford took the weighted end out of the air at the foot of the King's steps and hauled the heavier line down behind it hand over hand, into the cross-set, with the whole moving weight of the boat coming onto it. And then he carried it. He came up off the steps with the stern line over his shoulder and the flood dragging at the bite of it, trying to take it and him both into the deep. And he walked, not ran, walked, the slow, even, deliberate walk of a man who knows that to hurry in the worst place is to fall in it, the 40 feet to the deep bollards at the seaward head, and he dropped 3 turns of that line onto the bronze and took the strain himself, with his own back and his own braced legs, holding the sheer of 300 tons of boat on a turn of rope and his own refusal to be moved, until the cutter came round the head of the quay with the harbor master's men aboard and got a proper line on her, and the two of them together, the cutter pulling and Wexford holding, broke the sheer at last and brought Lacuna's stern back toward the stone, off the rocks, into the lee of the quay, where she could lie safe with her engines easing and her people, who had been a minute and a half from the rocks under the light, suddenly and simply not in any danger at all. It was over that fast. The sea makes its decisions quickly. That is why men like Wexford spend their lives learning to make theirs faster. One moment a dozen people were going to die in a famous old harbor on a fine June morning, and the next moment they were not, and the difference between the two was 4 minutes and one bare-headed man on the royal steps who had decided, without raising his voice, that the worst place was his. Captain Berth had watched all of it from the quay. He had been ashore directing things when the tide turned, which is the only reason he was not one of the dozen on the shearing deck. There is a justice in that I have thought about since, that the man whose vanity made the danger was the one man it spared, left ashore to watch the people he had brought into it be saved by the man he had shoved. He stood at the rope line where the harbor master's men had moved the public back, and he watched Daniel Wexford walk a stern line through a flood and hold 300 tons of boat on his own back, and his face did the thing I had been waiting all morning to see it do, though I took no pleasure in it by then, because there was nothing left to take pleasure in. It is not a small thing to watch a man understand, all at once, exactly what he has done and exactly what he had been wrong about. He had called that man a tin soldier. He had shoved that man to take his stone. And that man had just saved Berth's guests and Berth's boat as a matter of course, the way a thing is done by someone who has done it before, in the very place Berth had tried to clear him out of. The first thing Berth said, when Lacuna was safe and Wexford was coming back up the head of the quay soaked to the chest with the stern lines work done, was, and I want to record it exactly, because it is the most human and the most damning thing he said all day. He said, "I didn't know. I didn't know it would do that. Nobody told me it would do that." And the harbor master, old Pell, who does not raise his voice either, said, "I told you 3 times." Wexford said nothing. He walked up the steps and across the stone to where his rifle lay flat and his bearskin and gloves lay beside it, and he stood for a moment looking at the boat now lying safe in the quay's lee, and then he picked up the bearskin and set it back on his head, and pulled on the wet white gloves, and lifted the rifle and grounded it by his right boot, and turned his eyes back to the harbor mouth. He went back on his post, soaked, cold, having just done the hardest thing any of us would do that year. He simply went back to standing his watch, because his relief was not due until noon and the morning was not over, and the post was the point. I have seen brave things on the water. I am not sure I have ever seen anything that told me more about a man than that when the saving was done, he did not wait to be thanked, did not look around for the cameras that were certainly running by then, did not so much as glance at the man who had shoved him. He went back to his line and stood it, dripping, as though nothing had happened that a watch should take notice of, because to him the saving of those people was not a thing apart from the watch. It was the watch. It was the whole of why the king keeps a man on that stone at all. The cameras, of course, had got every bit of it. That is the part the modern world does to these stories that the old world never could. By that afternoon, there was footage from the rope line and footage from the customs cutter and footage from 3 of Murreth's own guests' telephones, and it was all of a piece, and it all told the same story, and the story it told was not the one Murreth had tried to write that morning. The clip that traveled furthest was 40 seconds long, and it had no commentary, because it needed none. It showed a man in a white blazer shoving a still red sentry, and the sentry giving an inch and not going. It showed the same man laughing at an old harbor master in a peaked cap. And then, with no cut and no kindness, it showed the tide turn and the white boat sheer, and the same red sentry strip off his bearskin and go down the king's steps into the flood and walk a line through it, and hold a boat full of people off the rocks with his own back. And then it showed him put the bearskin back on and go back to standing still. You did not need a caption to understand it. The morning had written its own. I will tell you what happened to Cash and Murreth, because the people who watched the clip wanted to know, and because the niche of the thing is that the consequence was not anything we did. We laid no hand on him. Wexford never spoke a word to him from first to last. We did not need to. The man had done everything to himself, in front of everyone, and all the morning required of us was that we not save him from it the way Wexford had saved his guests. The shove was the smallest of it in the end and the most certain. It was on a dozen cameras and on the harbor's own, and it was, in plain law, an assault on a sentry on royal ground, and he was charged with it. And there was no laughing it away and no card big enough to pay it off, because it was already written on film, in Pell's pencil, in 40 witnesses, and a thing already written cannot be bought. He stood in a courtroom some months later, and a magistrate who had watched the same clip the rest of the country had watched told him, in the dry way magistrates have, that the court took a particularly poor view of a man who would lay hands on a king's guard to take a mooring, and then require that same guard to save his guests from his own folly within the hour. The court fined him in a way that a man even of his means felt, and bound him over, and that was the law's small share of it. But the law was the least of what it cost him, and he knew it, and that was the part the sea added that no court could. Because the clip did not show a man who broke a rule. Rules can be argued. It showed a man who did not know the sea and would not be told, who laughed at the people who did, and who was wrong in the one place where being wrong gets people killed. And it showed all of that next to a man who knew the sea so well and so quietly that he could walk into the worst of it bareheaded and bring everyone home. And the world that watched it understood, the way sea people had understood it on the quay that morning in a single glance, that the difference between those 2 men was not money and was not certificates. It was that one of them was a seaman and the other one had only ever bought boats. There is no buying your way back from the whole world watching you find that out. He sold Lacuna within the year. The talk on the coast, and the coast talks, was that he could not bear to be aboard her, because every harbor he came into, somebody had seen the clip, and a man in a peaked cap was always very, very correct with him about the tides, in a way that let him know that they knew. He had crossed 3 oceans in that boat and meant to be a seaman in the way a man means to be a thing by owning the look of it, and the sea had told him in front of everyone, in the space of one morning's tide, that he was not and never had been, and he could not unhear it. The deep berth he had thought he could take by shoving a still man off it had nearly taken his guests, and had taken, in the end, the one thing he had been buying with the boat all along, the right to think of himself as a man the sea respected. He never got that back. You cannot. The sea does not give second opinions. The berth stayed reserved. That is the quiet end of it, the end that matters most to those of us who stand the watch, and the end the clip never bothered with because it is not dramatic. The polished chain went back up across the royal head of the quay the same afternoon, and the worn bronze bollards that had held 140-foot boat off the rocks went on being the king's bollards, and the deep water went on being kept clear for the sovereign's craft and nothing else, exactly as it had been kept for 300 years and would be kept after all of us were gone. The thing the harbor watch exists to protect was protected. Not the man's dignity, though that held too without a hand being raised. The berth. The watch. The plain stubborn fact that there are places not for sale, and stay not for sale because ordinary men stand on them and will not be moved, not by a shove, not by a card, not by a flood kept, in the end, by exactly the kind of man a fool mistakes for a statue. They wanted to give Daniel Wexford a medal. The household put it forward. There was talk of a decoration for the saving of life at sea, which he had earned 3 times over before this morning and never been given, because lifeboat coxswains who do their job are not, in the usual way, decorated for doing it. He turned it down. He turned down the medal and the offer of a transfer to a softer post, and the newspaper that wanted to put his face on its front under the words "the guard who wouldn't move," which he said got it precisely backward. "I moved," he told the young man from the newspaper. "When it was time, I moved. The standing still is only so the moving means something. Anybody can stand still. The trick is knowing which it is and not getting them the wrong way round." Then he went back to his watch, and the young man went away without a photograph. And that, I think, is the whole of Daniel Wexford in 3 sentences, and I have never heard it said better before or since. I asked him about it once, a long time after, on another flat dawn with the harbor like pewter, whether it had cost him anything to stand there and let the man shove him, knowing what he knew, knowing the tide, knowing the whole vain, stupid morning was coming. Whether it would not have been easier, better, even, to have said something, to have warned the man harder, to have stepped out of the costume for 1 minute and made him understand. Wexford thought about it the way he thought about everything, which is to say longer than you expected, and then he said the thing I have carried since. "You can't make a man hear the sea who's decided he already owns it," he said. "All you can do is stand on the stone he's trying to take and keep standing on it and be ready, because the sea's going to tell him the truth I couldn't, and when it does, somebody who knows the water had better already be standing in the worst place with his gloves off." He watched the tide for a moment. He thought the berth was something you could take by pushing. It isn't. None of the things worth keeping are. You keep them by standing there. And then, the one morning it matters, you keep them by going in. The flood was making again as he said it, the seam in the water coming in through the mouth the way it had that morning, the stream getting under the harbor and turning it from glass into something with a will of its own. Wexford grounded his rifle and squared the bearskin and put his eyes on the harbor mouth where a guard's eyes belong, on the place the worst thing would come from if it came that day, ready to be a statue for as long as the watch required it and a coxswain for the 4 minutes it might not. And I took up the radio, which is my place, and logged the state of the tide, which is the most useful thing I know how to do, and we stood the King's Harbor watch together on the stone that is not for sale. The way it has been stood for 300 years and will be stood for 300 more, by ordinary men who will not be moved. On the berth no one can take.